First tonight, a further tarnishing of the reputation of our taxi industry. The old complaints that you can't get a cab when you want one or that new drivers don't know where they're going have been replaced with far more ominous charges concerning the safety of female passengers. This week's sexual assault conviction against a driver and a subsequent allegation that sex is often traded for cab fares have painted the taxi industry as seedy and unsafe. The Transport Minister is Troy Buswell. He joined me from Albany. Troy Buswell, welcome to 7:30 WA.
Thanks, Jane.
Minister, when you took over the transport portfolio, you made cleaning up the taxi industry one of your priorities. But this week we've seen a taxi driver convicted of raping a passenger, and we've heard allegations that some drivers are accepting sexual favours in lieu of fares. So what is going on in this industry?
Clearly the case in relation to the rape was a concern. That's worked through the courts now. Clearly that driver will be incarcerated and has definitely lost their right to hold a taxi licence. The other driver who was involved, although not found guilty, has also had their licence terminated. So, and I think that sends a clear message, in particular in relation to the second person, and that is that, that this sort of action is not acceptable to the community. It's not acceptable to the government. And if you engage in that sort of conduct, then you'll have your licence suspended.
The allegations that this driver, who was acquitted, made following the court case was that he knew of 50 to 60 drivers who regularly accepted some sexual favours in return for, in lieu of fares. I mean, did this allegation shock you? Had you heard it before?
Well, I haven't heard that allegation before. I do have some concerns about the credibility of the individual involved. The one thing I know, though, is if a passenger feels that a driver has behaved inappropriately, then they should be making complaints either to the Department of Transport or the police. And particularly in cases where drivers touch passengers, those matters will be examined by the police, and as this case clearly shows, will be dealt with by the police and the courts, as you would expect.
Do you think that this warrants any sort of investigation, though? I mean, these are pretty serious allegations that have been made in relation to the sexual favours.
Well, again, when complaints are made, we take action. Now, I would expect that if inappropriate behaviour happens in cabs, then people will make complaints. Now, the one thing we are doing, I think very important, is putting much better camera technology into cabs. This will be the most advanced technology in cabs in Australia to record both visually and verbally what happens in the cabs, and that'll give us much more power to investigate complaints when they're made. If
it doesn't warrant an investigation, does it call for a re-education campaign, or do you need to be talking to the Taxi Council about this?
But we've certainly been working with the industry, and we've made some significant changes to some of the training that drivers receive in terms of what is acceptable behaviour. However, there are a few bad apples who I think are ruining a good industry that is serviced by a lot of good cab drivers.
But in this situation, though, the driver says he knows of 50 to 60 other drivers. So do you think this is more than just a few bad apples? I mean, is this potentially a trend?
Well, we can only really base our response on complaints made from passengers. And in the last 5 years, the number of cabs on the roads in Perth has gone up by about 50%. The number of complaints made against drivers has gone up by about 15%. In the case of, I think it's a Mr. Gill, he's made all sorts of claims. He also thinks he should have his licence back and be driving cabs. Now, I dispute that. Based on the evidence he gave in and around his own behaviour in the court, he doesn't deserve to be driving a cab, and he isn't. Now, he makes claims about the behaviour of other drivers and their passengers. That's not reflective in the complaints we get in, and at the end of the day, we act when we receive a complaint.
Minister, are you concerned that the events of this past week have really undermined your efforts to improve safety and standards in the taxi industry?
Well, I think the events are terrible, to be frank. To think that a person who may have had a little bit too much to drink, who's doing the right thing and catching a cab, is treated this way in a taxi, I think it's an appalling reflection on the individuals involved. Do we have concerns still about the industry more broadly? Yes, we do. Are we taking action to address that? We are. And the introduction of the cameras, more on-road compliance, the demerit point system, I think will all work together to help make our industry safer. Will we completely be able to rule out inappropriate behaviour by drivers in the future? Probably not. We can certainly do everything we can to minimise it, but what we'll also do is give ourselves the maximum capacity to investigate those complaints when they're made.
Both of these stories this week made national headlines, which obviously is a bad perception for the West Australian taxi industry. So, I mean, how will you convince people, particularly women, that it is still safe to catch cabs in Perth?
Well, look, there's no doubt that these two drivers and their treatment of the lady will have an impact on the taxi industry in Perth. You know, and I think that's really disappointing. My view, very strong view, is the vast majority of cab drivers are good people who want to provide a good service to the travelling public.
And are you confident that these safety measures that you're introducing in the cabs, the security cameras, the demerit system, will prevent such instances in the future?
Well, what they'll definitely do is they'll provide the safest environment within the cab for the travelling public that any cab user in Australia would have.
All right, Troy Buswell, thank you very much for your time.
No worries, thank you very much.